Welcome to Animark's training session on the Livestock Global Assurance Program, or LGAP. My name is Angela Schuster, and I will be taking you through this session called LGAP Standards Essentials. There are 3 sessions in this series available from Animark. Each session has been designed to build upon the content of the previous session. Session 1 provided a high-level overview of LGAP. Session 2 explored some of the practical applications and interactions you will have with LGAP in more detail. Session 3, this session, focuses on the LGAP standards and covers the essential information which will help you work with the standards and interpret and apply the requirements in the standards in the context of your business. We will introduce you to some of the detail in the standards, how the standards relate to ESCAS, what each standard addresses, and what you need to think about in terms of transitioning from ESCAS to LGAP, as well as auditing. This session is divided into 3 parts, and each part will be available on the Animark website. Part 1 of this session will touch on the role of the standards in general, why we have them, and the benefits they bring. And we will spend some time on the LGAP standards and their principles in general. Part 2 will focus on what we call the language of LGAP, and then dive into the LGAP standard, which relates to animal welfare and management. Part 3 will focus on the management system standard and the chain of custody standard, followed by a review of what we have covered throughout the whole session. And don't forget, each part is available from the Animark website, www.animark.com.au. Let's get started with part 1 of this training session on LGAP Standards Essentials, with a bit of a recap from our previous sessions. If you recall, in order to become certified under LGAP, there are a series of steps you need to follow, which start with an application and self-assessment process, then progress through to internal and external audits, the correction of non-conformities, and the awarding of certification. Certification is awarded for 3 years and requires ongoing surveillance activities to be undertaken, primarily through regular internal and external audits, as well as non-conformity management, which can lead to an escalation of non-conformities if they are not resolved satisfactorily. This session will look at the standards themselves and what you would be doing in order to demonstrate conformity as part of the certification pathway. Before we talk about LGAP specifically, I'd like to spend a bit of time looking at the role of standards in our world and what makes a standard a standard. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, defines a standard as a document that provides requirements, specifications, guidelines, or characteristics that can be used consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose. So what does that mean? Standards are formal written documents which essentially outline an agreed way of undertaking repeatable tasks. Standards are everywhere in our world and in our life and cover a wide range of subjects. For example, motorcycle and bicycle tyres have to be manufactured to certain standards to ensure safety on roads. The ISO has standards which relate to the size, construction, capabilities, and testing processes for tyres, and the fuel in cars has to be produced to an ISO standard for petroleum products to ensure it works and is safe. Standards are documents that provide a reliable basis for people to share the same expectations about a product, service, system, or process. If standards can be considered a shared set of expectations, then this allows us to ensure consistency and quality. Standards also help facilitate trade and business interaction, in that trading partners have the same expectations and understanding of conformity. It is easier to cooperate with other businesses when you are all operating on a common basis. They also assist with risk mitigation and compliance. Standards are typically written to prevent events which could compromise business efficiency or integrity and avoid undesirable consequences. Adhering to a standard helps to control risk and demonstrate compliance with regulatory obligations. In addition, having an agreed basis for cooperation between businesses also helps manage risks and hazards. Standards enhance safety and confidence in that practices, procedures, and processes are verified against a common set of requirements. When written properly, standards can also drive innovation and they promote continual improvement. Internationally, there are certain expectations for designing standards. In particular, ISO and the World Trade Organization have certain guidelines for writing standards. The ISO actually has a standard for writing standards. One of these internationally based expectations when designing standards is to ensure they are written to encourage innovation. This means standards should not unnecessarily prescribe how to undertake a particular task or process or what system to use, but rather describe the outcome which needs to be achieved. In particular, standards should not lock in specific technology or systems. In this way, those implementing the standards can be innovative in how they meet the requirements and demonstrate conformity. Another important aspect when standards are created is to ensure that a wide range of individuals and organisations are involved in the design process. In particular, it is expected that interested parties are widely consulted and included in the process. These interested parties include regulators, technical experts, and other organisations with relevant interests in the matter. Standards should also encourage trade rather than restrict it. The World Trade Organization in particular has expectations around ensuring standards do not present barriers to trade. That is obviously important when you are dealing with standards which have to be applied all around the world. Standards also have to demonstrate a benefit to the community as a whole, with a particular emphasis on business. Benefits are usually expressed through aspects such as health, safety, or other protections, including community trust. The standards development process itself should be transparent to all stakeholders and include opportunity for public comment. Importantly, standards should not be discriminatory and should be able to be applied by all users. I'll recap some of what you heard in the previous sessions regarding the LGAP standards and then move into the detail about each standard. The development of LGAP, and in particular the standards, occurred over a 4-year period and involved extensive consultation and collaboration. It drew upon the knowledge of a number of technical experts and a consultative committee made up of a range of stakeholders from the industry and government. Throughout the development process, significant consultation was undertaken, not just with stakeholders in Australia, but in all of Australia's export markets. In addition, consultation also occurred with industry and government personnel, animal welfare scientists and organisations, the World Organisation for Animal Health in particular, along with Professor Temple Grandin. Industry itself identified a number of challenges with ESCAS, which LGAP was required to overcome. ESCAS was developed to serve a purpose, that is, reopen trade. It was implemented in a 6-week timeframe and continues to be changed through the release of Export Advisory Notices, or EANs. The issues which were identified by industry and stakeholders related to ESCAS being perceived as a potential sovereign overreach, as well as issues which relate to practices being pristine on the day of audit, but falling out of compliance during what's called the inter-audit gap. There was also the view that LGAP presented an opportunity not just for conformity assessment, but a tool to manage risk and ensure continual improvement. Finally, there were concerns raised about the lack of impartiality in the audit process under ESCAS, as well as the duplication of auditing and the inconsistency in the application of requirements business to business and auditor to auditor. In addition to this consultation, which provided these insights and set the objectives for the development of LGAP, an international standards committee worked on the development of the standards, and this committee represented the interests of impacted stakeholders, which in the case of LGAP includes exporters, importers, feedlots, farms, and abattoirs. The committee also included technical experts from around the world. The standards were also released for public comment over a 60-day period, and significant feedback was received and considered. ANIMARC continues to ensure the LGAP standards follow expectations for standards design and have recently updated the LGAP standards to reflect changes to animal welfare and management approaches. These updated standards have been considered by ANIMARC's own International Standards Committee and were out for public comment. They have recently been accepted by ANIMARC's Standards Committee and endorsed by ANIMARC's board. As you can see, the development of LGAP was undertaken in a considered and collaborative manner to ensure it followed international expectations for standards design, as well as addressing issues with ESCAS identified through consultation and industry directives. You've met the suite of LGAP standards in our last sessions, but as a recap, they cover LGAP 1000, which are the fundamentals and vocabulary, LGAP 1001, which have the requirements for animal welfare and management, LGAP 1002, which include the requirements for the management system of operators and facilities, and LGAP 1003, which include requirements for operator chain of custody. If you recall, not all standards and all requirements in each standard are applicable to every operator or facility, and we will explore the standards in a bit more detail throughout the rest of this session. The 4 standards under LGAP are interrelated. You can think of them as cogs in a machine. They each have their own job to do, but are interrelated and work together to deliver an overall outcome. Importantly, the LGAP standards have been designed to be outcomes-based, which is in keeping with expectations for standards we heard about earlier. Each requirement is written to ensure the intended outcome is clear, but the specific method of demonstrating conformity with that requirement is not prescribed. This ensures that any operator or facility, regardless of their size or scale of operation, can be innovative in how to demonstrate conformity in the way that best suits their operation. The standards have also been constructed in this interrelated outcomes-based manner so that they are adaptable. Standards are considered living documents in that once you write them, they are continually reviewed and adapted over time to allow additional requirements or standards to be introduced. As we've heard before, not every requirement in each standard applies to every operator or facility. Just to recap what we heard in our previous sessions, to identify which LGAP standards and requirements apply to your business, you need to establish your scope of certification. And this is done by answering a few key questions. Which type of operator or facility are you? For example, are you an importer, exporter, feedlot, farm, or abattoir? If you are an abattoir, do you use stunning or non-stunning? Which species do you handle or manage? And what level of certification are you seeking? Once you've identified your scope of certification, you can refer to the LGAP standards, which specify requirements associated with the scope and activities of operators and facilities. If you look at the LGAP standards holistically and consider what you are currently doing to ensure ESCAS compliance, you should be able to demonstrate conformity with many of the LGAP requirements already. While we don't know your individual businesses and the arrangements you have in place currently to demonstrate ESCAS compliance, if we look at requirements between LGAP and ESCAS, on average across all operators and facilities, as well as for the different species and markets, then for LGAP 1001, or our Animal Welfare and Management Standard, there will be quite a lot of overlap between ESCAS and LGAP overall. For LGAP 1002, the Management Systems Standard, there will be overlap, but there are some areas which may sound new because of requirements which have been introduced to address ESCAS challenges or expectations. LGAP 1003, the chain of custody standard, should be complete for all operators. Now, this will vary business to business depending on the nature of the operation and how each business is currently demonstrating ESCAS compliance. For some, this may be higher, for some lower, and we will look at this as we go through the rest of the session. Just an important point on some of the estimates we refer to during this session in relation to overlap between ESCAS and LGAP. When you are looking at the LGAP requirements and comparing these with what you are doing under ESCAS, it's important to note that there is not a one-to-one or direct correlation. ESCAS and LGAP are constructed differently, and while they are both based on the same premise, being the World Organization for Animal Health's Animal Health Code, the way they have been put together differs. LGAP was not designed to replicate ESCAS. Remember, in session 1, we identified that ESCAS isn't solely the 4 principles and the ESCAS Animal Welfare Standard, but also about 33 export advisory notices, or EANs, and auditor guidance, along with other materials. There are also inferences and expectations under ESCAS which are not able to be interpreted consistently by all parties. LGAP is structured differently in comparison because it is a conformity assessment program rather than a regulatory framework. LGAP is based on scientific precedent and international standards and was charged by industry with addressing many of the challenges which exist in ESCAS. The considered development process LGAP followed, including industry and stakeholder consultation, allowed for the program to address identified areas which needed to be enhanced under ESCAS. LGAP strengthens the impartiality of the audit process, addresses the ongoing performance of operators and facilities during the inter-audit gap, delivers a tool to manage risk and compliance, and distributes responsibility across supply chain partners in a more balanced manner. As an example of how ESCAS and LGAP differ, the first requirement under ESCAS is that handling and movement of livestock must be carried out calmly and effectively, avoiding harm, distress, or injury. Auditors then look for specific evidence which demonstrates the intention of that requirement is being met. While this is written as a single requirement under ESCAS, there's a lot that makes up calm and effective, as well as avoiding harm, distress, and injury. Facilities are assessed against everything that makes up those terms, which includes the evidence provided in the ESCAS Animal Welfare Standard. There are many inferences in such a simply stated requirement, and on its own, it is open to interpretation by different parties, including auditors. As we heard earlier, the point of a standard is to provide a reliable basis for people to share the same expectations. Inferences and ambiguity do not lead to reliability and shared expectations. LGAP includes a similar requirement but provides greater clarity around what makes up calm and effective, as well as avoiding harm, distress, and injury. This means that it can be interpreted, implemented, and assessed by all parties consistently. In this example, what is considered in assessing calm and effective, as well as avoiding harm, distress, and injury, is clearly articulated across a number of requirements throughout LGAP 1001. This means a fair assessment of the various elements that contribute to these terms can occur. Non-conformities can be allocated against what is specifically causing the issue, allowing for greater insights into what needs to be improved. Before we dive into the individual standards, I'd like to cover how traceability and control is managed under LGAP. Traceability and control under ESCAS is based on a supply chain model which considers consignments and relies on declarations signed by exporters. LGAP takes a more holistic approach to control and traceability and considers internal traceability and external traceability and places auditable requirements on all parties in the supply chain which contribute to control and traceability. These requirements are distributed in the appropriate standards which apply to operators and facilities and would therefore be audited against. Control is provided through all certified operators and facilities adhering to the LGAP standards and certification rules. Exporters must adhere to the chain of custody standard, which requires exporters to only use certified downstream operators and facilities. The certification rules require importer operators and facilities to only use certified downstream facilities. In addition, downstream operators and facilities must adhere to the animal welfare and management standards, which includes arrangements for transport, management, and slaughter. And operators and facilities must adhere to the management system standard, which requires documented information to demonstrate how they conform with requirements under LGAP. Declarations are not utilised under LGAP as all parties are audited against the standards, which results in demonstration of conformity by evidence rather than an arbitrary signing of a declaration. Traceability is provided through the combination of requirements placed upon facilities and the requirements placed upon operators. And these requirements are specified in various sections within the 3 primary standards. Under LGAP, the method to ensure traceability, and that could be some form of technical system or an approach, isn't prescribed because, as we heard earlier, standards are outcomes-based to allow innovation and business adaptability and to ensure they don't restrict trade. The basis of traceability under LGAP is to ensure that animals are identified at every point, their movements are always recorded, and the data relating to that animal's identification and its movement is being collected and recorded, and then all of that is able to be transferred between supply chain partners. In some cases, operators and facilities may have sophisticated systems to underpin traceability. Auditing under LGAP for traceability and control checks that the information is being recorded and practices are being followed by the individual operator or facility. And the auditor records the outcomes of these assessments in Animark's conformance system. What this requirement means at a practical level is that there would be increased scrutiny through audits that these systems are working and evidence existed which verifies the effectiveness of the system to trace animals. Auditing the abattoir against the animal identification and livestock movement requirements under LGAP 1001, as well as the processes and documented information requirements under LGAP 1002, is a way to check that appropriate inwards traceability information has been recorded and that the death of the animal is recorded. This would include an abattoir selecting an identified animal or group of animals currently on site and confirming traceability data held within the abattoir for that animal or group of animals. It would also include an auditor selecting a slaughtered animal or animals from the data on site and confirming the incoming traceability data for that slaughtered animal or group of animals has been recorded. Auditing the feedlot against the animal identification and livestock movement requirements under LGAP 1001, as well as the processes and documented information requirements under LGAP 1002, checks that the inwards and outwards traceability data has been recorded. This would include an auditor selecting an identified animal or group of animals on site and confirming traceability data held within the feedlot for that animal. It would also include an auditor selecting a consigned animal or group of animals no longer on site and confirming the incoming traceability data for that outgoing animal has been recorded. There are also requirements on feedlots which relate to ensuring animal identification stays with the animal, how identification should be handled, and the need for the feedlot to record movements within the site itself, not just in and out. Auditing the importer against LGAP 1002 and 1003 ensures their system is recording inwards and outwards traceability data from their downstream facilities, and it aligns to what they have received from upstream supply chain partners and what they have provided them in return. Auditing the exporter ensures their outwards traceability data can be matched with the inwards and outwards traceability data from their downstream importers and facilities. This would include the auditor undertaking trace forwards exercises, where an animal the exporter exported is selected and data for that animal through the supply chain is recorded until death. It would also include the auditor undertaking trace backwards exercises, where an animal the exporter has confirmed in their data as slaughtered is selected by the auditor and data for that animal confirmed from the abattoir back through the supply chain to the exporter. This auditing approach would also apply to importers. There is also a requirement for 5% of through-chain audits to be conducted every year. This would involve an auditor following animals through a supply chain from start to finish and auditing against all requirements under LGAP, including traceability. That concludes part 1 of the LGAP Standards Essentials session. Please access part 2, which will focus on what we call the language of LGAP, and then the LGAP standard, which relates to animal welfare and management. You can access part 2 from the Animark website, www.animark.com.au.